Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. Welcome back to This Week in FCPA, episode 298 for the week ending April 22, 2022. The NBA playoffs are here. As Jay's beloved Celtics won game one with a buzzer beater and dismantled Brooklyn last night to go up 2-0, we are back to look at some of the week's top compliance and ethics stories in this edition. Jay, how are you feeling about your Celts?
I'm feeling good. I'm going to get on that bandwagon and ride it for at least this series and see how we do after Brooklyn, but I don't want to look too far ahead. What are the Rockets up to, Tom?
They are getting ready to pick first or second in the NBA draft.
Nice. So what is our first story to kick things off, Tom?
So, Jay, we have actually a trilogy of blog posts. Note the use of the big word trilogy from Mike Volkov. And Mike's a former federal prosecutor. So when he talks about federal prosecutions, you need to listen. And he really takes a look at some of the successes and setbacks the DOJ has recently had in criminal prosecutions. Most of us are thinking about the Roger Ong trial because the DOJ had a huge win there. He talked about that in the context of something I raised in my commentary on that trial, which was the Gunstein cases, which were uniformly tossed by the federal district court after mistrials in front of two different sets of juries. He also talked about the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos success as well. But Mike took a kind of a much broader view going back to the financial crisis of 2008, which he said was the absolute nadir of the Department of Justice, which he characterized in a line we're well known to us from Monty Python, Run Away. And there was a lot of criticism rightly leveled at the DOJ for its failures to take on the financial industry who put the country literally in recession with their financial engineering antics. But he brings that forward and talks about the trials that I mentioned, also a massive failure in the Boeing case where they tried to pin the entire 737 MAX disaster literally on one Boeing employee when it was a complete failure of culture, failure of institution, failure of corporate governance, failure at the board of directors level, failure at the CEO level. And in an interesting, almost throwaway line, he said, that's what happens when you outsource your investigations to big law firms. They don't go after the institutional players. They're not there to do that. So lots of insights into these three. Frankly, Jay, I don't typically see or hear Mike criticize the DOJ very much, but he leveled some pretty direct criticisms, and I hope that those who are reading him and listening him in the DOJ will take those critiques as really from the heart of a former federal prosecutor who believes the DOJ, at least as currently constituted, perhaps not under Trump, is a beloved institution and literally America's law firm, and they will take into account some of their successes, what were the reasons, and some of their failures and lessons learned there. But it's a really interesting three-part series, and I would commend it to every compliance professional to take a look at it. Jay, we've tried to have a segment on this show where I describe a fact pattern for you, and you tell me whether it is plausible for a Hollywood script. I'm not even going to try to describe this next fact pattern because when I described it to my wife, even she didn't believe it. So is there a sexual harassment case that is too implausible for Hollywood? And if so, what is it?
I think it's this one right here. Just a warning to everyone, we're a family-friendly show, but for the next couple minutes, I would suggest some earmuffs if there are youngins around. A female boss at a top DC consulting firm tried to perform oral sex on an unwilling male colleague in front of both her twin sister and the man's girlfriend, the lawsuit claims. Kyle Reinhardt, 53, is suing his former boss, Kim Circa, 47, over what he claims was an instance of sexual assault in 2017 and multiple other incidents. The U.S. Air Force veteran said he was fired from his $325,000 a year job at a consulting firm called Guidehouse last year, despite stellar performance reviews for refusing his boss's advances. Reinhardt helped the firm secure a $110 million contract with the Department of Veteran Affairs, but he says that all the while he endured a freewheeling drinking and sexual culture that was most evident during the all but required after-hours schmoozing. Reinhardt, a retired Air Force officer, studied architecture at Yale and health and urban planning at Harvard. He was a senior policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs and joined PricewaterhouseCoopers, which later spun off its public sector unit as Guidehouse in 2012. He began reporting to Circa, a partner at the firm, in 2015. Reinhardt is now suing his former boss and the company for unspecified damages, alleging discrimination, retaliation, battery, emotional distress, and a violation of wage payment laws. He says Guidehouse denied him 3 months severance that was specified in his contract, but is still enforcing the provision that prevents him from doing consulting work with the VA for 2 years. Across 31 sorted pages, Reinhardt details multiple instances in which Circa and others made him feel uncomfortable during late-night dinners and parties that he saw as necessary if he wanted to advance. Whenever he brought up his concerns, Reinhardt said he was told to play the game and keep everything in the family. Circa, of course, is denying all allegations. In a statement to the Daily Mail, her attorney, Charles Molster, called Reinhardt a disgruntled former employee who was terminated for performance issues and is now attempting to wage a smear campaign. Reinhardt said things changed in 2017 when he was passed over for a promotion and sent on increasingly cumbersome assignments outside of D.C. while being put up, and here's the tough part, cheap motels, including one with bloodstains on the furniture. He was placed on a pretextual performance improvement plan and was fired this past September in 2021. Reinhardt was not promoted to Guidehouse partner because he repeatedly refused to accede to Circa's advances and refused to participate in an improper sexual culture encouraged by Circa and fostered by the firm, the lawsuit states. He said Guidehouse denied him 3 months severance that was promised to him when he first joined, and the company, however, is still enforcing a provision that prevents him from consulting with past clients. He submitted a complaint with the D.C. Office of Human Rights for discrimination based on sex, retaliation, and status, and as a victim of sexual offense a month later, but he withdrew it in February. Reinhardt's attorney, Sam Buffone, says he's never come across a case like this. I have not encountered a work environment quite like this one, the attorney said. The world of government contracting can often have colorful workplaces, but what we see in the actions here are really way beyond the pale. Guidehouse and Circa's attorney did not immediately respond to requests for comments for dailymail.com. So that's one I'd never thought we'd be having here. Tom, what is your analysis of KT Corp's FCPA enforcement action?
So, Jay, it's actually not my analysis. It's the analysis of lawyers from Debevoise and
Plimpton.
Plimpton, yes. Kara Brockmeyer, Andrew Levin, Carlos Seeger, and Constantine Berlico wrote an article in Compliance Enforcement, New York University's great blog. And we've discussed the KT enforcement action on this podcast, Jay, but they had some interesting insights that we really hadn't focused on. And they said as a key takeaway that the SEC is looking more closely at charitable contributions, particularly additionally gift cards that can be easily converted into slush funds. So, Jay, I think over our compliance careers, we viewed sort of gifts, travel, and entertainment as relatively low-hanging fruit, both in terms of things that you can look at and remediate pretty quickly. It's easy, low-hanging fruit for the regulators too. And then a little bit above that is charitable contributions. So I really appreciated the Debevoise lawyers re-raising the issue of charitable contributions in the context of KT enforcement action. And what I would ask our listeners to consider, Jay, is that if give you a chance to go look at your program, are there any areas of weakness or red flags or even anomalies in your charitable contribution program? We've certainly seen those types of enforcement actions over the years. And Kara, Andrew, and company remind us that you need to pressure test your internal charitable donations programs to make sure that you don't have any anti-bribery, anti-corruption considerations in it going forward. So a good review. As I said, Jay, we have talked about this case, so I didn't want to really review the background facts of it because we've visited at it at some length when it was released earlier this year. But good piece from our friends over at Debevoise. But we did have, Jay, a major FCPA announcement, indeed yesterday, I believe, and the Stereocycle FCPA enforcement action. I have to throw my hat up to Harry Casson, continuing his father's great tradition of breaking all FCPA enforcement actions first. So from the FCPA blog, we got a great a summary from Harry Casson. And what did you see in this case that intrigued you, interested you, or other, Jay?
Thanks, Tom. And I'm also going to take a little bit from the DOJ's Wednesday press release that says Stereocycle agrees to pay over $84 million in a coordinated foreign bribery resolution. Stereocycle, which is an international waste management company headquartered in Lake Forest, Illinois, has agreed to pay more than $84 million to resolve parallel investigations by authorities in the U.S., Brazil, and Mexico, as well as Argentina. According to the court documents, Stereocycle entered into a 3-year deferred prosecution agreement with DOJ in connection with the filing of a criminal information charging the company with 2 counts of conspiracy to violate the anti-bribery provision of the FCPA and the FCPA's books and records provision. Pursuant to the DPA, Stereocycle's criminal penalty is $52.5 million. The department has agreed to credit up to 1/3 of the penalty and fines to authorities in Brazil and related proceedings, including an amount of $9.3 million for investigations in Brazil. In addition, Stereocycle has agreed to pay approximately $28 million to resolve a parallel investigation by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Stereocycle accepted responsibility for its corrupt business practices in paying millions of dollars in bribes to foreign officials in multiple countries, said Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Polite of the Justice Department. The company also maintained false books and records to conceal corrupt and improper payments made by subsidiaries in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Today's resolution with Stereocycle shows that the FBI and international law enforcement partners will not allow corruption to permeate domestic or international markets. The consequences of violating the FCPA are clear. Companies that bribe foreign officials for business advantage will be held accountable. According to the company's admissions and court documents, Stereocycle conspired to corruptly offer and pay approximately $10.5 million in bribes to foreign officials in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina in order to obtain and retain business and other advantages for the company. Specifically, between 2011 and 2016, Stereocycle caused hundreds of bribe payments to be made to official government agencies in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina to obtain and retain business. Under the DPA, Stereocycle agreed to continue to enhance its compliance program and maintain an independent compliance monitor for 2 years, followed by self-reporting for the department for the remainder of the term. There's a lot I didn't go into, code names for bribes and what they're doing, but these are the kind of matters that we usually see, that gifts and entertainment, bribes, and this has been going on. This investigation started back in 2011, so it's nice to see one of the more meatier cases come up. We're only in April, so hopefully this means that the floodgates could open up soon. Tom, what is our colleague Jacqueline Jager writing about in this week's issue of Compliance Week?
Well, Jay, before we leave Stereocycle, I think that the greatest or biggest takeaway, certainly for Mrs. this week at FCPA, was that cookies are now code words for bribes. Previously, we had chocolates, but now we have cookies. So really kind of set her back a notch for post-dinner evening cookies because now she has to associate that with illegal FCPA conduct.
Luckily, there's also ice cream in the Fox household, so maybe she can turn her vision that way.
Mrs. Compliance Evangelist. Yes, indeed. Jay, Jacqueline wrote a really interesting article about an SEC enforcement action where the SEC used data analytics to determine accounting fraud. And this involved Rollins, a pest control services provider, most well known for the company Orkin exterminators. And I'm not going to really go into the kind of the specifics other than there was an $8 million fine assessed against Rollins and $100,000 to the former CFO individually. But the significance here, Jay, is that the SEC is data mining companies' public information now from a data analytics perspective. And this is the fourth case, Jacqueline points out, where data analytics have been utilized by the SEC to bring an enforcement action. And this really speaks to an entirely new level of sophistication by the SEC. If they can review your public information and without a whistleblower, without someone coming forward with the information, and through a data analytics software or program or approach, then can determine that there's accounting fraud or other illegal conduct under the Securities and Exchange Act, that's a very powerful tool. And yesterday I was on a part of a conference in the Far East, which talked about the role of data analytics for internal audit. And I pointed them to this case and said, if the regulators have tools that are more sophisticated than you are behind the eight ball. And you have to be far ahead of the regulators in terms of the tools, strategies, and services you're delivering. And so I think this is going to be a huge wake-up call for internal audit and the internal audit function in corporations that they desperately need to have a data analytics capability, not simply a deep dive into 3 years worth of accounting records or corporate records, Jay, but really a much broader data analytics. And this, of course, inures to the benefit of the compliance professional. As you know, in the update, the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, the DOJ specified that compliance and the CCO had to have access to all siloed corporate data, and having internal audit with those same rights or those same abilities to get into data really gives the compliance professional a great internal corporate ally to help them in a data analytics function or component to compliance. Many of us, myself included, are legally trained, and at least in my legal education, did not include data analytics. And so if you can have an ally and internal resource, Jay, for the compliance function, this can be a really important tool for the compliance practitioner. So although this case focused on an accounting fraud and the actions of Rollins, and Jay, it was as, I don't want to say as straightforward as you can get, but it was simply figuring out what the analysts said the company's expectations were and beating it by a penny. Who does that sound like? Well, that was Enron. And that's what Jeff Skilling did every quarter. He figured out what the analysts wanted and he beat it by a penny using financial engineering. Well, that's what Rollins was doing here, except here the SEC caught them with their own data. So powerful tool, powerful enforcement action, a big, strong signal by the SEC, but significant implications for not only internal audit, but also the compliance function, Jay. Jay, we've recently had, we're a little bit past the first year of the SEC chairmanship of Gary Gensler. And he was fairly reflective in that. What did you see in the New York Times article?
Yeah, this comes to us by Efrat Livni, and some kind of like a travelogue of what Chairman Gensler has seen at the SEC over the last year. He was initially approved by the Senate in a 53 to 45 vote with, surprise, surprise, nearly all Republicans opposing his nomination. Gensler was a former Goldman Sachs executive and a veteran of both the Clinton and the Obama administration. The chairman has roused the ire of retail stock traders and crypto enthusiasts as he has raised alarms over market developments like the gamification of trading and the proliferation of unregistered cryptocurrency tokens. He's also under fire from a variety of industries for what they say is his overreach on issues like proposed climate disclosure rules and scrutiny of shell companies, and for the sheer amount of agency activity overall on his watch. As the nation's top markets regulator, Gensler was always going to be busy, but he was nominated during the unexpected trading frenzy in the so-called meme stocks like GameStop and AMC, which was driven in part by commission-free trading apps. No one could really be prepared for a job like that, Gensler told DealBook in an interview this week. That said, he took over the SEC after 18 years in the banking industry and served at the Treasury Department. A year in, there are times that, like these, that Gensler still pinches himself and thinks, wow, I've been asked to do this job? Gensler said, reflecting on what he'd been accomplished so far and explaining his regulatory agenda for the year ahead. In October, the agency published a 45-page report on the meme stock frenzy and examined how changes and tools were reshaping markets. The historic episode in 2021 was driven by retail traders using brokerage apps who banded together on social media to undermine big short sellers like GameStop and AMC, the movie theater chain. The report examined gamification of what Gensler calls the digital engagement, how apps can manipulate trading behavior through design features. Although the report did not propose new rules, it did suggest that they might be needed in the gamification of trading era. Companies have long reported climate-related information demanded by investors, though no mandatory standards currently exist. Without that standardization, Gensler said, investors have a hard time making meaningful comparisons and assessing progress. New rules proposed last month could address that gap. In March, the SEC gave initial approval to corporate disclosure rules on climate risks. Gensler points out that they are based on the input of investors, issuers, some academic experts, but not just government bureaucrats. There is nothing new about what the agency is doing, he argues, noting that risk disclosures were adopted in the 60s and that demand for environmental data began in the 70s, and almost every decade since has brought additional concerns to be monitored. Markets adapt and adjust to new risk, Gensler said, and so that which is material to investors can shift. Gensler's recurring theme in this interview and the story he's sticking to is fairness through information parity, in a principle that he believes applies to everything, including cryptocurrency. Despite the fascination with technology, or perhaps because of it, Gensler does not consider cryptocurrency quite as innovative as proponents claim, and he thinks many of the old rules suffice to regulate the industry. These trading platforms are not that different from the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, Gensler said, and that millions of people are meeting and buying and selling something that is most likely a security. These crypto tokens are crypto security tokens because entrepreneurs are raising money from the public, he added. This is what FDR in Congress addressed almost some 90 years ago, he insisted. You want to raise money from the public, and the public wants to take risk. That's fine, as long as you register with the SEC and you give them full and fair disclosure. Don't lie to them. Tom, what do you see when you look into the crystal ball of climate disclosures?
So, Jay, this article comes to us from Mai Khoi Nguyen Thon and Taylor Worth on the Corporate Compliance Insights. And it's entitled The Best Way to Navigate the Climate Disclosures Movement. And the article is really broken down into two parts. The first part I'll skip over pretty quickly because it details some of the large institutional shareholders who are really driving the ESG movement in their companies they're invest in. But near the end, they talk about the best practices takeaways. And Jay, these are certainly great takeaways in the ESG context. But I would like to, as I did with the article from Jacqueline Jaeger on the SEC enforcement action around Rollins, really take it as a starting point for what compliance needs to do. So let me start with the 3 points they first talk about for companies in their environmental practices. Number one, engage in a continuous discussion with your investor base, your largest shareholders in particular. Two, given the number of interested stakeholders and the overlapping potential interest or different types of areas of focus from those stakeholders, balance competing stakeholder interests with your environmental goals. And then three, management should keep the board updated on ESG matters and best practices. Now, Jay, I'd like to ask you to take those three concepts and apply them to the compliance professional. Well, a CCO, you need to talk to your largest shareholders. You need to let them know what you're doing and then broaden it out to stakeholders. If you look at what the Business Roundtable said on the purpose of the statement of a corporation, there were 5 distinct stakeholders in a company: shareholders, employees, third parties, customers, and localities. Well, they are going to have competing interests. So you as a CCO need to take that into account going forward. And then, of course, number 3 is keep the board up to date on what you are doing. We've talked a little bit in this podcast in the past about the evolving role of the board and its legal obligations under the Caremark standard from the state of Delaware. Well, your part of your role as a CCO is to educate the board on compliance, but also teach them what they need to do as a board around compliance. So I thought it was a great article. It's certainly great from the ESG perspective. But if you take those same lessons, Jay, and apply them to the compliance space, I think that there's some pretty good value there as well. Jay, our friend Francine McKenna started with a blog called Ray the Auditors. She took that work to the Wall Street Journal and their publication Market Watch. She went back out on her own. She's now scheduled to teach in the fall at a place I think you're familiar with, the Wharton School. But she wrote a most provocative article that was published in Time. And I'm not sure what the subscription rate or distribution rate, I suppose, of Time magazine is now. But in my day, it was the biggest magazine in America. And if you were in Time, you hadn't hit the big time. You were above the big time. So what did you see in this article that interested you or piqued your curiosity, if anything?
Yeah. So as Tom said, this is from Time, and it's entitled, Elon Musk should have been stopped long before he came for Twitter. Is Elon Musk serious about buying Twitter? Given his track record for trolling and half-baked provocations, Francine McKenna doubts it. Dubious offers happen, but CEOs of public companies with multi-billion-dollar market caps don't typically propose them. Musk often uses Twitter to deflect attention from serious negative reviews about him and his companies, and now he says he wants to own the social megaphone. Francine thinks Musk's tender offer to buy Twitter will fall apart because everyone, including the government regulators, should be on to his games. Twitter, as we know, recently adopted a poison pill against Musk on April 15th. The move makes it nearly impossible for him to buy enough Twitter shares on his own to gain control. Even so, Musk would have a much harder time making a pitch for Twitter if the U.S. SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, had properly sidelined him last time he attempted his antics. When the SEC settled with Musk in 2018 for casually tweeting about taking Tesla private at $420, wink, wink, the commission ordered him to step down as Tesla chairman, but still allowed him to continue as the CEO. Musk continued to be Tesla's largest shareholder with approximately 21.7% of Tesla's outstanding shares. Former SEC Chairman Jay Clayton said Musk's penalty reaffirms an important principle embodied in our disclosure-based federal securities laws. Specifically, when companies and corporate insiders make statements, they must act responsibly, including endeavoring to ensure that statements are not false or misleading. Not really what Musk is known for. The SEC should have also barred Musk from serving as an officer or director of any public company, a so-called D&O bar, back in 2018. Since financial penalties have minimal impact on multi-billionaires, in its original complaint, the SEC sought a full D&O bar against Musk. In the end, Musk's lawyers helped him avoid the penalty, and regulators relented, perhaps because of Musk's unusually close association with Tesla. Because the SEC and Department of Justice didn't stifle Musk's shenanigans when they had the chance, he's now been free as a bird to tweet long and loud about whatever multi-billion deal he's cooking up. Twitter investors' sentiment is on a roller coaster, up and down with each new Musk tweet or announcement over the past 2 weeks. Twitter stock jumped over $50 with news of Musk's initial 9.1% and then fell back down to 45.08 on April 14th, closing significantly lower below Musk's initial offer of $54.20 a share before the holiday weekend. Twitter opened slightly higher at the start of this week, but was still nearly 15% below Musk's bid. Twitter users, what Musk has referred to as a de facto town square, are arguably an important arbiter of the viability of the deal. Sentiment analysis using Google Trends, Brand24, and social search on the key dates of the Twitter acquisition campaign show that the de facto town square doesn't believe Musk either. Tom, we're up for your last story. What should be on the audit committee's agenda for 2022?
Jay, this article comes to us from the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance by several authors from Deloitte, Maureen Bugno, Krista Parsons, and Kimia Clemente. And they talk about some of the things that the audit committee needs to consider. And once again, Jay, these would be great topics for a compliance committee to consider. But for the audit committee, it's financial reporting and internal controls, enterprise risk management, and they have entire sections on ESG and cyber risk, data privacy, and data security. The digital finance transformation, that's the data analytics we talked about a little bit earlier, Jay. So a great, really summary of the things in audit committee, but I would, arguing to or pointing towards our compliance colleagues, ask them to consider this for the board compliance committee and take something like this to the board compliance committee, modifying it for compliance as opposed to audit and financial standards to really get them to look at various topics. Certainly ESG, if we'll just stick on that one a little bit, not look at ESG from the financial audit perspective, but from the compliance perspective. How have you complied with your own internal ESG policies and procedures, recognizing there's no national standard in the United States yet, or how have you looked at international standards going forward? So great piece in the Harvard Law School Forum. And once again, I think if compliance practitioners took a look at it and thought about it from the compliance perspective, it would be pretty instructive as well. Staying on an ESG kind of theme, Jay, what does Lawrence Heim have for us in practical ESG?
Great. His little article is entitled Putting the G First in ESG. Environmental and social issues attract significant attention and resources these days. And a new memo from shareholder advisory firm Squarewell Partners suggests that it may be time to reassess priorities and put corporate governance first, according to the report. And that's because governance should be viewed as the means of facing environmental and social risks and opportunities, not as an isolated element from this effort. one should not forget that the first recommendation of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, requests that companies disclose their governance structure around climate-related risks and opportunities. Governance is a structural property of a company and the foundation to set a company's purpose, direction, ability to perform, and most importantly, uphold its ultimate responsibility to be accountable. Squarewell is taking a particularly strong stand, saying it will be shifting their identity away from an advisor in the ESG space, and going forward, they will work to support their clients to be governed in a way that ensures sustainability. With governance at the forefront, Squarewell urges companies and boards to do things in light of the current investment decision-making trends in order to protect against reputational and business risks and potential dissidents. Number one, consider ESG disclosure as the bare minimum to satisfy requirements of the market. And two, communicate a robust equity story that highlights the opportunities to be seized in light of key E&S megatrends, decarbonization, digitalization, etc., and to attract active managers that allocate capital to fund your story. For more tips on establishing governance structures to navigate the most concerning E&S issues, mark your calendar for May 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Practical ESG webcast on the topic, Putting the G First, Oversight of E&S and ESG. You can attend the webcast for free if you're a Practical ESG member, or otherwise registration information will be included on the show notes. So Tom, that's our top 10 stories for the week. Why don't you tell us about the ever-growing cornucopia of podcasts that we have for this week?
So Jay, we had some great pods this week. On the FCPA compliance report, I had part 2 of a 2-part series with Matt Galvin, former CCO at AB InBev, and Dan Kahn, former head of the FCPA unit, the fraud division, and the head of the fraud division, assistant attorney general for the criminal division at the Department of Justice. In episode 1, we talked about dealing with the DOJ during an investigation and enforcement action. In part 2, we really took a deep dive into the Lisa Monaco speech and the enforcement action this week from Stereocycle. I thought really borne out. I've taken a deep dive into that in my blog post series on it. But they talked about the culture of the company. And then, of course, a monitor was imposed because, as they said in the deferred prosecution agreement, Stereocycle had not been able to thoroughly test their compliance program after the initial remediation because of the corrupt culture of the company. So great 2-part series. Those guys know as much compliance as anybody, and they probably forgot more than most of us. I have the only podcast dedicated to the intersection of compliance and ESG as well, and it's appropriately called Compliance ESG Podcast. But the thing about it, Jay, is it's a limited series. It will end in May, and it's also in the video format. So if you like to take in your podcast from a video side of things, it's on YouTube, and I've linked to the YouTube link in the show notes. Our most recent episode was with Erica Peters, of Exeter, and we talked about ESG standards. So if you want something for your viewing pleasure, it's definitely fulfills that. This month on The Compliance Life, I've had the pleasure, really, to visit with Susan Divers, a director of thought leadership at LRN. Susan was the CCO or CECO, I think, at AECon, a major international construction firm. She had a really fascinating life. And in this episode, which posted this week, we talked about her moving to the CCO chair and utilizing a lesson she learned in the prior portions of her career. Next week, as a little teaser, we're going to talk to her about her work at LRN and how being a CECO really informed that going forward. I have to bring up the MCU, Jay. Megan Doherty and I are on I'm not even sure how long anymore, exploration of the full MCU. Right now we're on the movies. We're probably going to go back and do the series as well. but at least within the movies, we're doing them in chronological order, not release date. So we had last week the Black Widow, this week the Black Panther. I don't know how many times I've seen the Black Panther. I still love it. It's Chadwick Bostwick is a great actor. I'm sorry we lost him way too early, but everything about the Black Panther was extraordinarily cool, literally from the first time I saw it in the theater. And the Black Widow, I was not a fan of on my first watching last summer, but I saw a lot more in it this time. And Megan really pointed out the sisters dynamic of big sister, little sister in it this way as well. Lastly, Jay, I hope that our listeners will consider going to Compliance Week 2022. It's going to be the first major conference since the pandemic shutdown of March 2020. Listeners to this podcast can get a discount by using the code TFLAW for $200 off. It's going to be a fabulous conference, some great keynote speakers, but most important, Jay, we're all going to be together again for the first time in over 2 years. So I hope listeners will consider Compliance Week 2022. I'm certainly looking forward to it, and I know you and your AMI colleagues are as well. So with that, Jay, back over to you.
Thanks, Tom. As always, Tom is the voice of compliance, and he can be reached at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. And I'm Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor. You can reach me at the initial J, ROSEN, at affiliatedmonitors.com. Both Tom and I would like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, episode 298 for the week ending April 22nd, 2022, the NBA Playoffs are here edition. We appreciate you spending some of your week with us, and we look forward to seeing you next week when we take a look at This Week in FCPA.